Hey everyone, and welcome to another video where today I am wrapping up all the books that I read in December. I'm not going to lie, this is the third time that I've sat down to try and film this wrap up. I don't know what's wrong with me at the moment, but I've not been sleeping very well, and I keep saying November when I mean to say December, and I keep saying 2020 when I mean to say 2021, and so if I do get any words mixed up, then that's why. So in total in December I finished 9 books. However, 2 of those books I did start at the end of November, and I did talk about them a little bit in my November wrap up. However, I couldn't give full reviews because I hadn't finished the books yet, and so I do want to include them in this wrap up too, just so I can share my full thoughts and opinions. As usual, I will have timestamps in the description so you can flick ahead if there are any particular books that you're interested in. So the first book that I finished in December was A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara, and this is a really difficult book to describe because it doesn't really have a plot. It's basically a character-driven novel about these 4 friends that met when they were in college and they now live in New York. And the story basically follows them and their friendships and their relationships over the next few decades. I think they're about 25, or they're in their kind of mid to late 20s at the very start of the book. The story is told from a few different perspectives, but it mostly focuses on Jude, who's one of the friends, and it's hinted at the very start that he experienced some kind of abuse in his childhood, and you learn more about what happened to him over the course of the book, and you see how it's had this lasting impact on his life. What I really liked about this book was the writing and how the characters felt very real. I felt like I was reading about real people, and so even though it's quite a slow-paced book, it didn't feel like a chore to get through, in the sense that because I was invested in these characters, I wanted to keep reading to find out what was going to happen to them. Although I'm really glad that I read this book, it's a really difficult book for me to recommend because it was so emotionally draining, and there's quite a few trigger warnings in this book. There's actually quite a lot of trigger warnings in this book, especially for child abuse and for self-harm. And I'm quite glad that before I read the book, I looked up the trigger warnings. Even though I'm used to reading about difficult topics, I think that even just seeing the amount of trigger warnings that come with this book, it helped me to prepare myself for what I was going into. I can understand why so many people like this book and why so many people have said that it's one of their favourite books. However, I didn't think that it was enjoyable because it was just so sad and it was very overwhelming in places. And so if you are thinking about reading this, I would just say be careful. The next book I'm going to talk about is Beartown by Fredrik, and this is contemporary fiction about a small Swedish community where everyone is pretty much obsessed with hockey. The junior hockey team of this town are about to play, I think it's the semi-final of the hockey league, and basically if they win this league, not only will it bring a lot of joy and pride to the town, but it could also bring tourism and jobs, and so there's a lot of pressure on these teenagers to perform well and to win. What I really liked about this book was the way that it was written, because it starts by introducing you to this town and there's all these different perspectives, and so you get to understand why hockey means so much to the people of this town and why they care so much that this hockey team wins. Part of the way through the book, something happens that changes the tone and divides the community, and I wouldn't consider this a spoiler because I've mentioned it in previous videos because I've heard people talking about it, and I wouldn't consider it a spoiler because it's a trigger warning, and also because I don't think it affected my overall enjoyment of the book. I still gave it 5 stars, but I know that some people would want to go into the book not knowing that, so I think all I'm going to say is to please check the trigger warnings for this book before you read it. I'll leave a link to the Goodreads page in my description of this video so that you can check those out before. Like I said, I knew about this before I read the book and I didn't feel like it made any difference. I don't think my opinion would have been different if I hadn't known beforehand. The next book I read was Everything I Know About Love by Dolly Alderton, and this is non-fiction, and I'm pretty sure it's kind of a memoir because Dolly basically takes us through different stages of her life, from when she was a teenager, through university and through her 20s, right up until around her 30th birthday. I had a feeling that I would like this book, but I wasn't expecting to love it as much as I did, because it was so funny in places, but also really, really relatable. There's one quote in particular that really stood out to me, and I can't remember it exactly, but it went something like, when you're young and you go through a breakup, you lose a partner. Whereas as you get older, the older that you get, when you go through a breakup, you don't just lose a partner, you also lose a whole life together. And I think that really hit me in a way that I wasn't expecting. This is the kind of book that I want all of my friends to read because I feel like they would find it really relatable too. However, there are a couple of trigger warnings, especially for eating disorders, but also if cancer is something that you find quite hard to read about, then there are a couple of chapters in this book that you might find difficult. And so just bear that in mind too if you are thinking of reading this. The next book that I read was One True Loves by Jenkins Reid, and I don't know how to describe this book. I want to say that it's contemporary fiction, but I know that some other people would say that it's a contemporary romance. I don't personally feel like it was a romance, but I can see why some people would say that. The story follows a woman called Emma who met this guy Jesse when she was 16, 17, and they started a relationship and fell in love, and they pretty much had a perfect life. They travelled the world together and they were very happy. They got married when they were 25 and things seemed to be going great. However, on their 1-year wedding anniversary, Jesse is away for work and the helicopter that he's in goes down over the ocean, and so he is missing and presumed dead. Emma is obviously completely heartbroken, but over the next couple of years she does start to move on with her life, and she ends up reconnecting with an old family friend and they fall in love and they also get engaged. But at the start of the book you learn that Jesse has been found and is actually alive, and so the book is kind of split in two because the first half you follow Emma's relationships with both of these guys, and then the second half is her trying to work out what to do with this situation. I really enjoyed the first half of this book because I really felt for Emma being in this situation of having to make this impossible decision between two people that she really cares about. But then with the second half of the book, I felt like things started to go downhill quite quickly. And I think my main issue was that this is quite a short book. I think it's less than 300 pages, and I didn't feel like there was enough time for the decisions to be made and for them to make sense. I felt like things were wrapping up quite quickly, and so it ended up feeling not very realistic. Because of the plot of this book, I was expecting to feel a lot more emotional than I did, and it ended up just feeling a bit flat, and so I did give this 3 stars. I could appreciate the overall message that the book was trying to get across, but I think that it could have been executed in a better way. The next book I'm going to talk about is Christmas Shopaholic by Sophie Kinsella, and I'm just going to quickly talk about this book because it's obviously a Christmas book, but this basically follows a woman called Becky who is a shopaholic, and she's hosting Christmas for the very first time for her family, and things don't quite go according to plan. There's a lot of things that go wrong, and so it's a very light-hearted, funny read. Like, there was some parts that made me laugh out loud. I gave it 3 stars in the end because it was fine, but I didn't love it. So these next 2 books I'm going to wrap up quite quickly because I am in the middle of filming a vlog that includes these 2 books, and so I will share my main thoughts and feelings in that vlog, just in case anyone was wondering. So the next book that I read was Northern Lights by Phillip Pullman, and this is called The Golden Compass in certain countries, just in case anyone was wondering, and it's the first book in the His Dark Materials trilogy. It follows a girl called Lyra who goes on this quest to find her friend Roger, who has been kidnapped, and it's set in this world that's very similar to ours, except that everyone has something called a demon, which is an animal that is part of you but that lives outside your body. I really enjoyed this book. I felt like the first half was quite slow in places because it focuses a lot on world building. However, the action and the pace does pick up in the second half, and I love the setting and how it's very snowy and wintry, and it is the perfect book to read around this time of year. There were certain details within this book that I didn't pick up on the first time I read it when I was a kid, and so I did really appreciate that. And I also think that the TV adaptation has done a really good job of capturing the essence of what these books are about, and so I would also really recommend that if you haven't seen it already. The next book that I read was also a reread, and that was Noughts and Crosses by Malorie Blackman, and this is a really difficult book to describe. It's young adult fiction that's set in a world that's kind of parallel to ours, so it's similar but also very different. It follows 2 teenagers called Sophie and Callum, and Sophie is a cross, which means that she has dark skin and she lives a life of privilege, whereas Callum is a naught, which means that he has pale skin and he faces a lot of prejudice and is treated like a second-class citizen, because in this world the lighter that your skin is, the more prejudice that you receive. The book is told from 2 perspectives, so you get alternating chapters with Sophie's point of view and then Callum's point of view, and I really liked the setup of this book because it meant that you could see how both characters interpreted certain events and you could see their thoughts and feelings. Because this is a young adult novel, the writing was very simple and there was a little bit of teenage angst because the main plot of this book is this star-crossed lover storyline. However, I didn't mind that at all. I thought I'd mention it just because I expect that when I read young adult books. I expect there to be a certain amount of angst and I expect there to be a certain type of writing style. However, I loved this book. I ended up giving it 5 stars because even though it must have been about 10 or 15 years since I've read this book, it still felt very powerful and it still made me feel as emotional as it did the first time I read it. So finally, I'm going to finish this video by talking about The Lord of the Rings. So if you've been watching my wrap-ups for the past few months, you'll know that I've been reading this series as part of the Tolkien Along, which is a Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit read-along that's being hosted by Beth and Ashleigh. I'll leave all the links to that in the description if you wanted to find out more. But we started with The Hobbit back in September and then moved on to The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and finally The Return of the King. So I have read one Tolkien book per month for the past 4 months. And I have really loved my experience of reading these books, but also I am so relieved that I'm done. I don't want to talk about these books too much because I feel like I've talked about these books a lot in recent wrap-ups, but I did really enjoy the audiobooks for these. I listened to the audiobook while also reading along with the physical book, and I think that really helped to focus me. And I really enjoyed the way that the narrator did the different voices for the characters, but also the way that whenever it got to a big action sequence, the narrator picked up the pace and injected this excitement that made me feel excited and that made me want to keep on reading. The only thing I will say is that there were a few chapters throughout all 3 books that felt a little bit, not necessarily pointless, but I felt like they didn't add anything to the story as a whole. And so I felt like it was a bit of a chore to get through them, to then get to a different perspective that I was interested in. The ending to this actually made me cry, which I really wasn't expecting. And so I did end up giving this book 5 stars. I think I gave the first book 5 stars as well, and then the second book 4 stars. Overall, I'm really glad that I reread this series as an adult because I could appreciate the writing so much more. And I think that if you've been wanting to read this series but you've been putting it off because maybe you're a little bit intimidated, then I do think that these are a lot more accessible than their reputation would imply. Okay, so that brings me to the end of the video. Thanks for watching if you've made it this far. If you've read any of the books that I've mentioned in this video, then please let me know in the comments what you thought of them. And yeah, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it and click subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.